In the summer of 1987, the Peterson family sat down for dinner in their modest home in Millbrook, Vermont. 4 people, 4 plates, 4 chairs around a wooden table. By morning, the house stood empty. The food had gone cold. The chairs remained pushed back, as if everyone had simply stood up and walked away. But they never walked back. For 36 years, their neighbors wondered. Their friends mourned. The police investigated and found nothing. Until a contractor, demolishing the abandoned Peterson house in 2023, discovered something behind the basement walls that would finally answer the question everyone had stopped asking. Where did the Petersons go? What he found was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. If you're drawn to unsolved mysteries and the dark truths that surface after decades of silence, subscribe now. The wallpaper in the Peterson house had faded to a sickly yellow by the time Marcus Webb first stepped through its front door. 36 years of neglect had transformed the once cheerful family home into something that resembled a mausoleum. The air tasted of rot and time. Thick enough to coat the back of his throat, Marcus had been hired to demolish the structure, to clear the lot for new development. The town council had finally decided that the Peterson house, long abandoned and falling into dangerous disrepair, needed to go. It had stood empty since that summer night in 1987, a monument to a mystery no one had solved. He'd grown up hearing the stories everyone in Millbrook had. Thomas Peterson, 39, a high school math teacher. His wife Claire, 37, who worked at the town library. Their daughter Emma, 15, honor student and promising violinist. Their son Michael, 12, Little League champion. One evening they were there. The next morning, though, gone. As Marcus walked through the hollow rooms that October afternoon in 2023, his work boots echoing on bare floorboards, he felt the weight of those disappeared lives. Children's drawings still clung to the refrigerator, their corners curled with age. A violin case sat in the corner of what had been Emma's room, gathering dust like a forgotten prayer. He was supposed to start with the roof, work his way down systematically, but something about the basement called to him. Perhaps it was the way the door at the end of the kitchen hallway stood slightly ajar, though the realtor had sworn every door had been closed and locked for decades. Perhaps it was the draft of unusually cold air that seemed to exhale from that darkened space. Marcus descended the wooden stairs slowly, his flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed almost solid. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and a dirt floor, support beams running like ribs through the space. He was about to turn back, convinced there was nothing to see, when his light caught something odd about the far wall. The concrete looked newer there, a slightly different shade of gray. And when he stepped closer, pressing his palm against the surface, he could feel it, a hollow space behind, something that shouldn't be there. He didn't know it yet, but Marcus Webb was about to uncover the answer to Millbrook's oldest mystery, and he would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd never looked behind that wall. The September morning in 1987 started like any other in Millbrook, Vermont. Margaret Thornton, the Peterson family's next-door neighbor, was watering her roses when she noticed that Claire's car still sat in the driveway at 9 o'clock. That was unusual. Claire always left for the library by 8:15, precise as clockwork. Margaret had set her watch by Claire's routine for the 3 years they'd been neighbors. By 10 o'clock, Margaret's mild curiosity had sharpened into concern. She'd knocked on the front door twice, called Claire's name through the mail slot, even walked around to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. Everything looked normal inside. The table was set with 4 plates, though the food on them had clearly been left out overnight. A pot sat on the stove. The refrigerator hummed its familiar song, but no one answered her calls. Margaret returned to her own house and phoned the library. No, the director told her. Claire hadn't come in, hadn't called either, which wasn't like her at all. Should they be worried? Margaret called Thomas's school next. He hadn't shown up for his first period class. The secretary sounded puzzled. Mr. Peterson never missed a day without calling ahead. Never. The police arrived at 11:30. Officer Daniel Chen, young and relatively new to the force, took Margaret's statement on the Petersons' front porch, while his partner, the more experienced Sarah Hendricks, walked the perimeter of the house. The front door was locked. All the windows were secure. The back door, however, stood unlocked, which Claire's routine would explain, since she typically left through the kitchen. They entered the house, with Margaret following close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs. The living room revealed nothing unusual. Magazines sat in a neat stack on the coffee table. The television remote rested on the arm of the couch. Family photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, faces frozen in happier moments. In the kitchen, the scene grew stranger. 4 plates of what had been meatloaf and green beans sat on the table, untouched, except that someone had taken a single bite from one portion. 4 glasses of water, the ice long since melted. 4 napkins, folded and placed just so. Everything arranged for a family dinner that had apparently never been eaten. Officer Hendricks moved through the house methodically, her trained eyes noting details. Upstairs, the beds were made. Emma's violin sat in its case beside her music stand. Michael's baseball glove rested on his desk, a ball still nestled in its worn leather palm. In the master bedroom, Claire's purse sat on the dresser, her wallet inside, with cash and credit cards untouched. Thomas's car keys hung on their hook by the front door. No signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry, no signs of anything except a family that had simply ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. Officer Chen found Thomas's grade book in his study, tomorrow's lessons already planned out in his careful handwriting. Claire's library badge lay on the kitchen counter beside a grocery list that mentioned milk and bread and Emma's favorite cereal. Normal things, everyday things. The debris of lives interrupted. By afternoon, the Peterson house had become a crime scene, though no one could identify what crime had been committed. More officers arrived. The local sheriff, Gerald Walsh, a man who'd lived in Millbrook for 40 years and knew every family on every street, stood in the kitchen and shook his head slowly. "It's like they evaporated," he said to no one in particular, staring at those 4 plates of cold food. "Just vanished into thin air." But people didn't vanish into thin air, Officer Hendricks thought, as she photographed every room, every surface, every detail that might later prove important. People left traces. They always left traces. The question was whether anyone knew where to look. Outside, neighbors had begun to gather on the street, drawn by the police presence. Margaret Thornton stood among them, twisting her hands together, replaying the morning in her mind. Had she heard anything unusual last night? Any sounds from next door? She couldn't remember anything out of the ordinary. Just a quiet September evening, stars bright overhead, the crickets singing their autumn song. As the sun began to set on that first day, painting the Peterson house in shades of orange and shadow, Sheriff Walsh made the official declaration. The Peterson family, all 4 members, were missing. A search would begin at first light. None of them knew then that the search would continue for 36 years, that the mystery would outlast marriages and careers, that children would grow old still wondering what had happened to the family that disappeared on that September night. None of them knew that the answer was closer than they thought. buried in the darkness beneath their feet. The search began with sunrise the next morning, though it felt like searching for ghosts. Volunteers from across Millbrook gathered in the high school parking lot, their faces etched with worry and disbelief. Sheriff Walsh divided them into groups, each assigned a section of the woods that surrounded the town. If the Petersons had wandered off for some reason, if they'd had an accident, the searchers would find them. But the woods yielded nothing, no trace of footprints, despite the recent rain that should have preserved them. No torn fabric caught on branches, no disturbed undergrowth suggesting a group of people had passed through. The forest stood silent and undisturbed, keeping its secrets. Officer Sarah Hendricks focused on what they did have rather than what they didn't. She interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the family in the days before the disappearance. Thomas's fellow teachers described him as reliable, dedicated, perhaps a bit reserved. Claire's co-workers at the library painted a similar picture of a woman who kept to herself, but was always kind, always helpful. Emma's friends said she'd been excited about an upcoming violin recital. Michael's baseball coach reported nothing unusual about the boys' behavior or mood. No one had noticed anything wrong. No one had sensed any danger approaching. The Petersons' bank accounts went untouched. Their credit cards showed no activity. Thomas's car remained in the garage, Claire's in the driveway. Their luggage sat in the hall closet, packed with mothballs and waiting for a vacation that would never come. 3 days after the disappearance, FBI agents arrived from Burlington. Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, a woman with steel-gray eyes and 20 years of experience with missing persons cases, walked through the Peterson house with the methodical precision of someone who had seen too many mysteries without solutions. She stood in the kitchen for a long time, studying those 4 plates of untouched food. Something about the scene troubled her, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. It looked staged, she thought, but immediately dismissed the idea. Why would anyone stage a normal family dinner? "Tell me about the family dynamics," Morrison said to Margaret Thornton, who'd become the unofficial spokesperson for the Petersons' lives. They sat in Margaret's living room, where she could see the Peterson house through her front window. They were quiet, Margaret said, choosing her words carefully. Good neighbors, kept to themselves mostly, but always friendly when you ran into them. Thomas mowed their lawn. Every Saturday morning, Claire baked cookies for the neighborhood kids at Christmas. Any arguments? Any signs of marital trouble? Margaret shook her head. Nothing like that. They seemed devoted to each other, to the children. What about the children? Any problems at school? Any trouble with other kids? Emma was a model student, serious about her music. Michael was more outgoing, popular with his teammates. Normal kids living normal lives. But that was the problem, Morrison thought. As she left Margaret's house, normal families didn't vanish without a trace. There was always something, some crack in the facade, some warning sign that had been missed or ignored. She ordered her team to expand the investigation. They polled the family's phone records, searched for any unusual calls in the weeks before the disappearance. They interviewed distant relatives, checked for any family history of mental illness or sudden departures. They looked into Thomas and Claire's backgrounds, searching for hidden debts or secret troubles. They found nothing. A week became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became a month. The FBI agents eventually left, promising to keep the case open, but offering no hope of quick resolution. The searchers returned to their regular lives. The Peterson house stood empty, a question mark on an otherwise ordinary street. Officer Hendricks couldn't let it go. She visited the house almost daily, walking through its rooms as if the furniture might suddenly speak and tell her what it had witnessed. She sat in the kitchen and stared at that table, trying to imagine what had happened there on that last evening. Had someone come to the door? Had the family answered and invited danger inside? But there were no signs of struggle, no signs of fear. The house whispered of normalcy, of routine, of a family going about their evening like thousands of other families in thousands of other towns. Except this family had disappeared. On her 10th visit to the house, Hendricks descended into the basement, something she'd done only once before, during the initial investigation. The space was unremarkable: concrete walls, support beams, boxes of old belongings stacked in corners. A water heater hummed in one corner. Spiders had claimed the ceiling, their webs swaying gently in the basement's still air. She walked the perimeter slowly, her flashlight playing across every surface. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. But something made her pause at the far wall. Some instinct that had kept her alive through 10 years of police work. She pressed her hand against the concrete. It felt solid, cold, immovable as stone. She couldn't know that 36 years later, another person would stand in this exact spot and finally discover what lay behind that wall. She couldn't know that the answer had been there all along, buried in darkness, waiting. 5 years passed, then 10. The Peterson case became one of those stories people told at dinner parties, a local legend that newcomers to Millbrook learned about within their first month. The house remained empty, caught in legal limbo, as distant relatives argued over the estate and banks fought over mortgage payments on a property no one wanted to claim. Sarah Hendricks, now a detective with the Vermont State Police, kept a file on her desk that grew thicker with each passing year. Not with new evidence, there was none, but with theories, possibilities, questions that haunted her dreams. She'd investigated dozens of other cases in the years since that September morning, solved most of them. But the Petersons remained her ghost, the one that got away. In 1995, 8 years after the disappearance, Hendricks received a phone call that made her heart race with hope. A woman's body had been found in the Connecticut River, badly decomposed. Initial estimates put her age around 40, the right range for Claire Peterson. Hendricks drove through the night to the morgue, stood over the remains with her breath caught in her throat, waiting for dental records to confirm or deny. The body wasn't Claire's. It was a woman from Massachusetts, missing for only 3 weeks. Another family's tragedy, another mystery solved, but not the one Hendricks needed. Margaret Thornton grew older in the house, next door to the Petersons' empty home. She watched seasons change through her window, watched the Petersons' lawn grow wild and unkempt, watched paint peel from the siding and shingles slide from the roof. Sometimes, late at night, she thought she saw lights in the windows next door. But when she looked again, there was only darkness. She never stopped wondering, never stopped replaying that last conversation she'd had with Claire, 3 days before the disappearance. They'd talked about roses, about the approaching autumn, about Emma's upcoming recital. Nothing significant, nothing that hinted at what was coming. "Do you think they're dead?" Margaret's husband asked her one evening, 10 years after the Petersons vanished. Margaret stared at the darkened house next door. "I think something terrible happened, something that shouldn't be possible in a place like Millbrook." By 2000, though, the case had gone completely cold. The FBI file was archived. Local police had no active leads to pursue. The few investigators who still thought about the Petersons did so with a sense of defeat, knowing they'd missed something crucial, something that would explain everything, but having no idea where to look. Emma Peterson would have been 28 that year. Michael would have been 25. Somewhere, were they living different lives under different names? Or had they been buried in unmarked graves, their bones turning to dust, while the world forgot them? Hendricks attended a conference on cold cases in Boston that year. She presented the Peterson case to a room full of seasoned detectives, forensic specialists, and criminal psychologists. She laid out every detail: the untouched dinner, the locked doors, the complete absence of evidence. She showed them photographs of the house, of the family, of the life they'd lived before they stopped living it. "What's your theory?" a detective from New York asked when she'd finished. Hendricks hesitated. She'd developed several theories over the years, each one more unlikely than the last. "I think they knew their killer," she said finally. "I think someone came to that house, someone they trusted enough to let inside. And I think whatever happened next happened so quickly that they didn't have time to fight back or call for help." "But where are the bodies?" another investigator asked. "You've searched the woods, the nearby lakes, every possible disposal site. Nothing." "I know," Hendricks said quietly. "That's what keeps me awake at night." The conference moved on to other cases, other mysteries, but Hendricks sat in her hotel room that evening, the Peterson file spread across her bed, and made herself a promise. She would never stop looking, never stop asking questions. Even if it took the rest of her life, she would find out what happened to that family. Years continued their relentless march. 2005, 2010, 2015. Margaret Thornton passed away in 2018, never knowing the truth about her vanished neighbors. The Peterson house fell deeper into decay, its windows broken by vandals, its walls covered in graffiti. The town council debated tearing it down, but legal complications kept delaying the decision. Sarah Hendricks retired from the Vermont State Police in 2020, but she took the Peterson file with her. In her home office, she pinned photographs of the family to a corkboard and stared at their faces, searching for answers in their frozen smiles. "Where did you go?" she whispered to those photographs, just as she'd whispered 1,000 times before. "What happened to you?" The house knew. It had always known. But houses keep secrets better than people do, holding them in their walls and floors and foundations until someone finally asks the right question or looks in the right place. That time was coming. The demolition permit was finally approved in 2023. The Peterson house, after 36 years of standing empty, would be torn down. The lot would be cleared. A new family would build a new home on that land, never knowing what lay buried beneath their feet. Unless someone looked, unless someone found what had been hidden all along. Marcus Webb first saw the Peterson house on a gray October morning. In 2023, he'd been hired by the development company that had finally acquired the property, tasked with demolishing the structure and preparing the land for new construction. He was 52, a veteran of 30 years in the demolition business, and he'd torn down hundreds of buildings in his career. Empty warehouses, condemned apartments, abandoned factories, structures that had outlived their usefulness and needed to be cleared away to make room for something new. But something about the Peterson house made him uneasy from the moment he pulled his truck into the overgrown driveway. Maybe it was the way the windows stared out, like hollow eyes. Maybe it was the stories he'd grown up hearing, whispered tales of the family that disappeared without explanation. Or maybe it was something else, something he couldn't name, a feeling that the house was waiting for him. He walked through the property that first morning, making notes on his tablet, assessing the work that needed to be done. The structure was in worse shape than he'd expected. The roof had partially collapsed in the northeast corner. Water damage had rotted through much of the second floor. The foundation showed cracks that spoke of decades without maintenance. It would take 2 weeks, maybe 3, to bring the whole thing down safely. He'd start with the roof, work his way down floor by floor, save the basement for last. Standard procedure, nothing complicated. He was supposed to start the next day, but that evening Marcus found himself driving back to the property. He told himself it was professional thoroughness, wanting to double-check his measurements before beginning demolition. But as he stood in the empty living room, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, he knew that wasn't entirely true. He was drawn to this place, drawn to its mystery. Marcus had read the newspaper archives about the disappearance. Everyone in Millbrook knew the basic story, but he'd wanted details. He'd spent hours at the library, scrolling through microfilm of old newspapers, reading about the search efforts, the police investigation, the theories that had swirled through town in the weeks and months after the Petersons vanished. Some people thought they'd been murdered by a drifter passing through town. Others believed Thomas had killed his family and then himself, hiding the bodies so well that they'd never been found. A few whispered about witness protection, about secret government programs, about aliens and supernatural explanations that grew more elaborate with each retelling. But no one really knew. The truth had remained hidden for 36 years. Marcus made his way through the house slowly that evening, his footsteps echoing in empty rooms. He found children's drawings still taped to the refrigerator, their colors faded to pastels. A calendar on the kitchen wall, frozen on September 1907. Dishes in the sink, covered in dust so thick they looked like archaeological artifacts. In Emma's room, he found sheet music scattered across the floor. Beethoven, Mozart, pieces that spoke of a girl with talent and dedication. Her bed was still made, the quilt pulled tight, pillow arranged just so, waiting for someone who would never return. Michael's room held baseball trophies, their plastic gold finish dulled by time. Posters of 1980s sports heroes hung on the walls, their edges curled and peeling. A child's life, preserved like an insect in amber. Marcus stood in the master bedroom and tried to imagine what that last evening had been like. Had the Petersons known something was wrong? Had they felt fear? Or had everything seemed normal, right up until the moment it wasn't? He should have left then, should have gone home to his own family, his own warm house, where people existed and breathed and lived. But something pulled him toward the basement door. That same instinct that had made him uneasy all day now drew him downward, into the darkness beneath the house. The basement stairs creaked under his weight, each step announcing his presence to the empty air. His flashlight beam swept across concrete walls, support beams, the accumulated junk of a life interrupted. Old paint cans, boxes of Christmas decorations, a rusted bicycle with flat tires. And then his light found the far wall, and Marcus stopped breathing. The concrete there looked different, newer, smoother, as if someone had patched over something, had wanted to hide whatever lay behind. Marcus crossed the basement slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed his palm against the concrete. It felt hollow. There was definitely a space back there, a cavity in the wall that shouldn't exist. He should have called someone, should have contacted the police, let them investigate. But his curiosity was too strong, his need to know, too powerful. He returned to his truck and retrieved a sledgehammer, telling himself he'd just make a small hole, just peek inside to see what was there. The first swing sent cracks, spider webbing across the concrete. The second swing broke through, revealing darkness beyond. The third swing widened the hole enough for his flashlight to penetrate. Marcus Webb aimed his light into the gap he'd created, peered into the space that had been sealed for 36 years. What he saw there made him drop the flashlight and stumble backward, his mind refusing to process what his eyes had shown him. He made it halfway up the basement stairs before his legs gave out, and he sat down hard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He'd found the Petersons, all four of them, but they weren't buried. They weren't hidden in some makeshift grave. What Marcus had discovered was far stranger, far more disturbing than anything he'd imagined. Behind that false wall, the Peterson family sat around a table, still sitting, still there, exactly as they'd been 36 years ago, frozen in time like a photograph, like a museum display, like a nightmare that had somehow become real. Detective Sarah Hendricks received the call at 7 in the evening. She'd been retired for 3 years, spending her days tending her garden and trying not to think about the cases she'd never solved. But the moment she heard the name Peterson, her hands began to shake. "We need you here," the current sheriff told her. His name was Marcus Chen, son of the officer who'd been first on scene 36 years ago. "Someone's found something at the house, something impossible." Hendricks drove through the October darkness, her retired badge still tucked in her wallet, her mind racing with possibilities. In all her years of theorizing, of imagining what might have happened to the Peterson family, she'd never considered that they might still be in the house, that they'd been there all along, hidden behind walls, while search parties combed the woods and divers searched the lakes. The property blazed with lights when she arrived. Police vehicles, ambulances, crime scene vans, all parked haphazardly across the overgrown lawn. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire house. Officers stood in clusters, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Sheriff Chen met her at the door. He was young, maybe 35, but his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen something that changed them. "I need to prepare you," he said quietly. "What's down there? It's not what you'd expect." Hendricks had prepared herself for bodies, for bones, for the grim evidence of murder hidden away in darkness. But as she descended the basement stairs, following Chen's flashlight beam, she realized that no amount of preparation could have readied her for what awaited. The demolition contractor sat on the bottom step, wrapped in a blanket, despite the October warmth, his face gray with shock. Hendricks recognized the look. She'd worn it herself more than once over her career. "Through there," Chen said, pointing to the jagged hole in the far wall. Hendricks approached slowly. Someone had widened the opening, broken away enough concrete to reveal the space beyond. Floodlights had been set up, their harsh glare illuminating what had been hidden for 36 years. It was a room, a sealed chamber, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls on all sides. And in the center of that room sat the Peterson family. They were at a dining table, the same table that had sat in their kitchen upstairs. 4 chairs, 4 plates, 4 glasses. Thomas at the head of the table, Claire to his right, Emma and Michael on the opposite side, just as they'd been on that September night in 1987. Except they weren't bodies. They weren't skeletons. They were preserved, frozen in time, through some process Hendricks couldn't immediately identify. Their skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. Their clothes, the same clothes they'd worn that last evening, looked faded but intact. Their eyes were closed, their faces peaceful, as if they'd simply fallen asleep at the dinner table and never woken up. "Jesus Christ," Hendricks whispered, her voice barely audible. The forensic team was already at work, photographing every angle, taking measurements, collecting samples. Dr. Lisa Torres, the medical examiner, stood near the opening in the wall, her expression troubled. "I've never seen anything like this," Torres said, when Hendricks joined her. "The preservation is nearly perfect. No decomposition, no insect activity. It's like they were sealed in amber." "How is that possible?" Hendricks asked. "I don't know yet. The room appears to be airtight. There's some kind of chemical residue on the walls and floor. We'll need to analyze it, but my preliminary guess is that someone created an environment that prevented decay. Low oxygen, specific temperature, chemical treatments. It would take extensive knowledge of preservation techniques. Hendricks stared at the family sitting in their tomb. Someone put them here. Someone who had access to this house, who had the knowledge and resources to build this chamber and seal them inside. "There's more," Chen said quietly. He led her around to the side of the table, where the floodlights revealed something Hendricks had missed in her initial shock. The plates in front of each family member held food, the same meatloaf and green beans that had been on the kitchen table upstairs. But these portions had been eaten, mostly finished, and beside each plate sat a glass, empty, except for residue at the bottom. "They were drugged," Torres said. "That's my working theory. Someone fed them dinner, probably with something mixed into the food or drinks. Something that would act quickly, that would be painless. They probably fell unconscious right here at this table. And then someone carried them down here," Hendricks continued, the picture becoming clearer and more horrible. "Set up this table, positioned them like they were still having dinner, and sealed them in. The real dinner upstairs was staged," Chen added, "left as a false trail, making it look like they vanished during the meal, when actually they'd already been down here, already dead or dying." Hendricks felt her legs weaken. She'd spent decades trying to solve this mystery, imagining 100 different scenarios. But this careful staging, this preservation, this grotesque memorial, it spoke of something deeply wrong, a mind that had planned everything with meticulous precision. "We need to find out who had access to this house," she said, her detective instincts overriding her shock. Who could have built this chamber without being noticed? The construction alone would have taken time, materials, expertise. "We're already looking into that," Chen said. "But there's something else you need to see." He led her to the back wall of the sealed chamber, where something had been carved into the concrete. Letters, painstakingly etched by hand, forming words that made Hendricks's blood run cold. "Family together forever. Preserved in perfect love. No more pain. No more sorrow. Only peace." Below the words was a signature, or what passed for one. Just two initials, carved with the same careful precision as the message above, RQ. "Do those initials mean anything to you?" Chen asked. Hendricks stared at the letters, her mind racing through 36 years of investigation, thousands of interviews, countless pieces of evidence. And then slowly, a memory surfaced. Something small, something she dismissed as irrelevant at the time. "Robert Keller," she whispered. "He was Thomas Peterson's best friend. They'd known each other since college." "Where is he now?" Chen asked. "I don't know. He left town shortly after the disappearance. I interviewed him before he left. He said the investigation was too painful, too many memories. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but she should have. She should have questioned why a best friend would leave so suddenly, would abandon the search for his missing companions. She should have pushed harder, investigated deeper. "Find him," Hendricks said, her voice hard with determination. "Robert Keller is our killer. And after 36 years, it's time he answered for what he did." Chapter 5. Detective Sarah Hendricks received the call at 7 in the evening. She'd been retired for 3 years, spending her days tending her garden and trying not to think about the cases she'd never solved. But the moment she heard the name Peterson, her hands began to shake. "We need you here," the current sheriff told her. His name was Marcus Chen, son of the officer who'd been first on scene 36 years ago. "Someone's found something at the house, something impossible." Hendricks drove through the October darkness, her retired badge still tucked in her wallet, her mind racing with possibilities. In all her years of theorizing, of imagining what might have happened to the Peterson family. She'd never considered that they might still be in the house, that they'd been there all along, hidden behind walls, while search parties combed the woods and divers searched the lakes. The property blazed with lights when she arrived. Police vehicles, ambulances, crime scene vans, all parked haphazardly across the overgrown lawn. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire house. Officers stood in clusters, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Sheriff Chen met her at the door. He was young, maybe 35, but his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd seen something that changed them. "I need to prepare you," he said quietly. "What's down there? It's not what you'd expect." Hendricks had prepared herself for bodies, for bones, for the grim evidence of murder hidden away in darkness. But as she descended the basement stairs, following Chen's flashlight beam, she realized that no amount of preparation could have readied her for what awaited. The demolition contractor sat on the bottom step, wrapped in a blanket, despite the October warmth, his face gray with shock. Hendricks recognized the look. She'd worn it herself more than once over her career. "Through there," Chen said, pointing to the jagged hole in the far wall. Hendricks approached slowly. Someone had widened the opening, broken away enough concrete to reveal the space beyond. Floodlights had been set up, their harsh glare illuminating what had been hidden for 36 years. It was a room, a sealed chamber, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with concrete walls on all sides. And in the center of that room sat the Peterson family. They were at a dining table, the same table that had sat in their kitchen upstairs. 4 chairs, 4 plates, 4 glasses. Thomas at the head of the table, Claire to his right, Emma and Michael on the opposite side, just as they'd been on that September night in 1987. Except they weren't bodies. They weren't skeletons. They were preserved, frozen in time, through some process Hendricks couldn't immediately identify. Their skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. Their clothes, the same clothes they'd worn that last evening, looked faded but intact. Their eyes were closed, their faces peaceful, as if they'd simply fallen asleep at the dinner table and never woken up. "Jesus Christ," Hendricks whispered, her voice barely audible. The forensic team was already at work, photographing every angle, taking measurements, collecting samples. Dr. Lisa Torres, the medical examiner, stood near the opening in the wall, her expression troubled. "I've never seen anything like this," Torres said, when Hendricks joined her. "The preservation is nearly perfect. No decomposition, no insect activity. It's like they were sealed in amber." "How is that possible?" Hendricks asked. "I don't know yet. The room appears to be airtight. There's some kind of chemical residue on the walls and floor. We'll need to analyze it. But my preliminary guess is that someone created an environment that prevented decay. Low oxygen, specific temperature, chemical treatments. It would take extensive knowledge of preservation techniques." Hendricks stared at the family sitting in their tomb. Someone put them here. Someone who had access to this house, who had the knowledge and resources to build this chamber and seal them inside. "There's more," Chen said quietly. He led her around to the side of the table, where the floodlights revealed something Hendricks had missed in her initial shock. The plates in front of each family member held food, the same meatloaf and green beans that had been on the kitchen table upstairs. But these portions had been eaten, mostly finished, and beside each plate sat a glass, empty except for residue at the bottom. "They were drugged," Torres said. "That's my working theory. Someone fed them dinner, probably with something mixed into the food or drinks, something that would act quickly, that would be painless. They probably fell unconscious right here at this table. And then someone carried them down here, Hendricks continued, the picture becoming clearer and more horrible. Set up this table, positioned them like they were still having dinner, and sealed them in. The real dinner upstairs was staged, Chen added, left as a false trail, making it look like they vanished during the meal, when actually they'd already been down here, already dead or dying. Hendricks felt her legs weaken. She'd spent decades trying to solve this mystery, imagining 100 different scenarios. But this careful staging, this preservation, this grotesque memorial, it spoke of something deeply wrong, a mind that had planned everything with meticulous precision. We need to find out who had access to this house, she said, her detective instincts overriding her shock. Who could have built this chamber without being noticed? The construction alone would have taken time, materials, expertise. We're already looking into that, Chen said. But there's something else you need to see. He led her to the back wall of the sealed chamber, where something had been carved into the concrete. Letters, painstakingly etched by hand, forming words that made Hendricks's blood run cold. Family together forever. Preserved in perfect love, no more pain, no more sorrow, only peace. Below the words was a signature, or what passed for one. Just two initials, carved with the same careful precision as the message above. RKU. Do those initials mean anything to you? Chen asked. Hendricks stared at the letters, her mind racing through 36 years of investigation, thousands of interviews, countless pieces of evidence. And then, slowly, a memory surfaced. Something small, something she'd dismissed as irrelevant at the time. Robert Keller, she whispered. He was Thomas Peterson's best friend. They'd known each other since college. Where is he now? Chen asked. I don't know. He left town shortly after the disappearance. I interviewed him before he left. He said the investigation was too painful, too many memories. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But she should have. She should have questioned why a best friend would leave so suddenly, would abandon the search for his missing companions. She should have pushed harder, investigated deeper. Find him, Hendricks said, her voice hard with determination. Robert Keller is our killer, and after 36 years, it's time he answered for what he did. Word count. Chapter 5, 798 words. Chapter 6. The manhunt for Robert Keller began within hours of finding the sealed chamber. FBI agents descended on Millbrook again, this time with a suspect's name and a clear direction for their investigation. What they discovered about Robert Keller painted a picture that was both enlightening and deeply disturbing. Keller had been 38 in 1987, a year younger than Thomas Peterson. They'd met at the University of Vermont, where Thomas studied mathematics and Keller pursued a degree in mortuary science. After graduation, Keller had opened a funeral home in Millbrook, building a respected business over 15 years. He'd been a fixture in the community, trusted with the town's dead, known for his gentle manner and professional discretion. He'd also been unmarried, socially isolated despite his public role, and according to old colleagues, increasingly obsessed with preservation techniques. He'd attended conferences on embalming, on taxidermy, on chemical preservation of biological materials. His colleagues had thought it was professional dedication. Now it looked like something else entirely. He had the knowledge, FBI Special Agent David Park told Hendricks as they reviewed Keller's background in the makeshift command center set up in what had been the Petersons' living room. He had access to chemicals, to equipment, to everything he'd need to create that chamber and preserve the bodies. And he had opportunity, Hendricks added. She'd pulled her old files, was reading through interviews she'd conducted 36 years ago with fresh eyes. Thomas and Claire trusted him. He'd been to their house dozens of times. He could have come and gone without raising suspicion. The question was why. What would drive a man to murder his best friend's entire family and then preserve them like specimens in a museum? The answer came from Keller's sister, Janet, who agents located living in Maine. She was 68 now, her hands trembling as she spoke about the brother she hadn't seen in decades. Robert was different after our parents died, Janet told Agent Park, over video call, her face grainy on the laptop screen. They were killed in a car accident when he was 25. He became obsessed with death, with preserving things. He told me once that if he could stop decay, stop the process of bodies breaking down, then death wouldn't really be death anymore. Did he ever talk about the Peterson family? Park asked. Janet's face crumpled. He loved them. That was the problem, so he loved Thomas like a brother, loved Claire like she was his own wife, loved those children like they were his. I think, in his mind, they were his family, the family he'd never had after our parents died. The psychological profile began to take shape. Robert Keller, traumatized by his parents' sudden death, unable to form normal relationships, had fixated on the Peterson family as a replacement for what he'd lost. And when he'd learned something that threatened that fantasy, he'd taken action to preserve it. There was a conversation, Janet continued, her voice barely above a whisper. About a month before the family disappeared, Robert told me that Thomas and Claire were talking about moving. Thomas had been offered a position at a private school in Connecticut. Much better pay, better opportunities for the kids. They were planning to leave Millbrook. There it was, the trigger, the thing that had pushed Keller from obsession into action. He couldn't let them go, Hendricks said quietly, understanding flooding through her. He couldn't bear the thought of losing them, so he decided to keep them, forever. Records showed that Keller had closed his funeral home 2 weeks after the Petersons' disappearance, claiming he needed time away from Millbrook to grieve. He'd sold the business, sold his house, and vanished as completely as the family he'd murdered. But people left trails, even careful people. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit began tracking Keller's movements through bank records, credit cards, property purchases. He'd changed his name 3 times over the years, had moved from Vermont to New Hampshire, to Maine to Canada. He'd worked odd jobs, staying off the grid, never settling anywhere for long. The trail ended in Nova Scotia, in a small fishing village called Prospect Bay. A man matching Keller's description had been living there for the past 8 years under the name Richard Kane. He worked as a handyman, kept to himself, was considered strange but harmless by the locals. Canadian authorities were alerted. An extraction team was assembled. After 36 years, Robert Keller would finally face justice for what he'd done. But when the team arrived at the small cottage where Keller had been living, they found it empty. The doors stood unlocked. The interior was sparse, just a bed, a small kitchen, a single chair by the window. On the table sat a newspaper, 3 days old, with a headline visible, "Missing Vermont Family, Found After 36 Years." Keller had seen the news. He knew they were coming. In the bedroom, agents found walls covered with photographs, pictures of the Peterson family, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows. Thomas and Claire's wedding, Emma's first day of school, Michael's Little League games, family Christmases, birthday parties, ordinary moments of a life now gone. And in the center of this shrine, a handwritten note, the same careful script that had carved those words into the concrete wall 36 years ago. I only wanted to keep them safe, to preserve what was beautiful before the world could destroy it. They were my family, the only family I had after mine was taken from me. I gave them peace. I gave them eternity together. Now you've disturbed that peace, violated that eternal rest. I cannot let you destroy what I created, what I preserved. Forgive me." Below the note on the floor was an empty pill bottle. The label indicated morphine, enough to kill if taken all at once. Search teams scoured the area around Keller's cottage. They found his body 2 days later, at the bottom of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. He'd taken the pills, then walked to the edge and let gravity finish what he'd started. Robert Keller was dead. The man who'd murdered the Peterson family, who'd sealed them in concrete and chemical preservation, who'd carried that secret for 36 years, had chosen his own ending rather than face judgment for his crimes. Some might have called it justice. Hendricks, standing in that cottage and staring at the photographs on the walls, felt only a hollow sense of completion. The mystery was solved. The killer was dead. But the Peterson family was still gone. Their lives cut short by a man who'd claimed to love them. There were no winners here, only ghosts, and the questions that would haunt everyone who'd been touched by this case. Why hadn't they seen it sooner? How had Keller moved so freely between obsession and normalcy? What signs had they missed that might have saved 4 innocent lives? The questions would never be fully answered. Some secrets died with the people who kept them. The Peterson family was finally laid to rest on a cold November morning, 2 months after Marcus Webb broke through that basement wall. The entire town of Millbrook attended the funeral, along with people from across Vermont who'd followed the case for decades. They came to bear witness, to pay respects, to close a chapter that had remained open for 36 years. The service was held at St. Michael's Church, the same church where Thomas and Claire had been married 22 years before their deaths. 4 caskets, sealed and draped in white, sat at the front of the sanctuary. The medical examiner had performed the necessary examinations, had confirmed what everyone already knew. The family had been poisoned with a combination of sedatives and muscle relaxants, slipped into their evening meal. They'd likely fallen unconscious within minutes, had died without pain or awareness of what was happening to them. Small mercies, people said. At least they hadn't suffered. At least they'd been together. But Sarah Hendricks, sitting in the 3rd row and staring at those 4 caskets, couldn't find comfort in those thoughts. The Petersons had suffered, just not in the way anyone had imagined. They'd suffered by having their lives stolen, their futures erased, their memories preserved like insects in amber by a man who'd claimed to love them. The priest spoke about eternal rest, about families reunited in heaven, about the peace that surpassed understanding. The words washed over the congregation like water, offering comfort where comfort could be found. But underneath the familiar rituals, underneath the prayers and hymns, there was something else, a horror that couldn't be spoken aloud in this holy place. Robert Keller had kept them in that basement for 36 years, had visited them probably, had descended those stairs and stood before his creation, his preserved family, his eternal monument to a love that had twisted into something monstrous. The forensic team had found evidence of regular maintenance, chemical treatments applied to prevent decay, adjustments made to the seals that kept the chamber airtight. He'd tended to them like a gardener tending plants, like a curator maintaining a museum display. And all the while, the world above had searched and mourned and wondered, never knowing that the answer lay buried in darkness just beneath their feet. After the service, the caskets were transported to Millbrook Cemetery. The burial plot had been purchased by the town council, a gesture of collective guilt for failing to protect this family, for failing to find them when they'd been so close all along. The graves were dug in a neat row beneath an old oak tree. The 4 of them together, even in death, just as Keller had wanted. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face gaunt. He hadn't slept properly since making the discovery. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that sealed chamber, saw the Peterson family sitting at their eternal dinner. His wife had begged him to see a therapist, to talk to someone about the trauma. He'd promised he would, someday. As the caskets were lowered into the ground, a sound rippled through the crowd. Quiet weeping, the kind that comes from deep wells of grief. They were crying not just for the Petersons, but for the innocence that had died with them, for the illusion of safety that had been shattered, for the knowledge that monsters didn't always look like monsters, that they could be trusted friends, respected members of the community, people who smiled and shook hands and committed unspeakable acts behind closed doors. After the last prayers were said and the crowd began to disperse, Hendricks remained behind. She stood over the freshly filled graves, reading the headstone that had been erected for the family. 4 names, 4 dates of birth, and a single shared date of death. September 18, 1987. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the cold November air. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry we didn't see what was right in front of us." The wind carried her words away, and Hendricks turned to leave. But as she walked back toward her car, she noticed something that made her pause. On the edge of the Peterson plot, half hidden in the grass, was a single white rose, freshly cut, its petals still soft and fragrant. She looked around, but the cemetery was empty, except for the groundskeepers in the distance. Who had left a rose? The funeral flowers had all been arranged around the graves, but this single bloom sat apart, placed with obvious intention. Hendricks picked up the rose, examined it closely. There was no card, no note, nothing to indicate who'd left it. But as she held it, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. Robert Keller was dead. They'd identified his body, performed an autopsy, buried him in an unmarked grave in Nova Scotia. There was no doubt about his death, no question of his guilt. So who had left this rose? Hendricks told herself it was nothing. A well-wisher who'd wanted privacy. A distant relative no one knew about. A stranger moved by the tragedy. There were a dozen rational explanations. But as she drove away from the cemetery, the rose sitting on her passenger seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that some piece of the puzzle remained hidden, waiting to be discovered. The Peterson house had been demolished after the bodies were removed. The lot had been cleared. The earth turned and graded. In the spring, a new family would build a new home on that land, would create new memories to replace the old nightmares. But the basement remained. The sealed chamber had been left intact, preserved as evidence, documented in photographs and videos that would be stored in archives and studied by criminologists for decades to come. A monument to one man's obsession, to love twisted into horror, to the darkness that could hide in plain sight. Sometimes, local teenagers claimed they could still feel something there, that if you stood on the empty lot at night, you could sense the weight of what had been buried, could almost hear voices whispering from beneath the earth. Stories to scare each other, urban legends in the making. But Marcus Webb, driving past the lot one evening a week after the funeral, could have sworn he saw something. A flicker of light in the darkness where the basement had been. A shadow moving where no shadow should exist. He didn't stop to investigate. He pressed the accelerator and drove faster, telling himself it was nothing, just his traumatized mind playing tricks. But that night, he dreamed of the sealed chamber, of the Peterson family sitting at their eternal table. And in his dream, their eyes were open, staring at him with expressions he couldn't read. Millbrook tried to return to normal. The news crews departed. The true crime podcasters moved on to other stories. The FBI closed their files and archived the case as solved. Life continued as it always did, flowing around tragedy like water around a stone. But for those who'd been closest to the case, for Hendricks and Webb and Sheriff Chen, and all the others who'd seen what Robert Keller had created, normal would never quite return. They'd seen too much, understood too much about what humans were capable of when love curdled into possession, when the need to keep something forever led to the destruction of what made it beautiful in the first place. The Peterson family was gone. Robert Keller was gone. The house was gone. But the horror remained, buried in memory, preserved perfectly in the minds of those who'd witnessed it. Some things once seen could never be forgotten. Some chambers once opened could never be sealed again. 5 months after the Peterson family was buried, Sarah Hendricks received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just her name and address, written in careful, old-fashioned script. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, and her breath caught in her throat. The first page bore an inscription: "The Journal of Robert Keller, a record of perfect love." Hendricks sat at her kitchen table and began to read. The entries dated back to 1982, 5 years before the murders. They detailed Keller's growing obsession with the Peterson family, his conviction that they were meant to be his elaborate fantasies about preserving their happiness forever. The entries grew darker as the years progressed. Keller had learned about the family's plan to move, had felt betrayed by Thomas's decision to take his family away. He'd spent months planning, researching preservation techniques, building the sealed chamber in secret during the night, while the Petersons slept upstairs, unaware of the tomb being constructed beneath their feet. The final entry was dated September 18, 1987, the day of the murders. "Today, I gave them peace. Today I ensured they would never leave me, never change, never grow old or sick or unhappy. They are perfect now, preserved in the moment of their greatest beauty. Tomorrow the world will search for them, but they will always be with me, safe in their eternal home. This is my gift to them, my expression of perfect love." Hendricks felt sick reading those words, but she forced herself to continue, to read every entry, to understand fully the mind that had committed such horrors. And as she reached the end of the journal, she found something that made her blood run cold. A final note, added recently, the ink still fresh on the page: "To whoever finds this, I am not the only one who understands the necessity of preservation. There are others like me who see the beauty in stopping time, in keeping precious things safe from the decay that awaits all living things. We have watched each other from a distance, recognized kindred spirits, though we have never met. When you read this, know that perfect love still exists in the world, and it is still creating monuments to eternity." Below this message was a list of names and addresses, 7 of them, scattered across the United States and Canada. And beside each name, a date. Hendricks's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She called Sheriff Chen, then the FBI, then every law enforcement contact she still had. Within hours, teams were dispatched to each address on the list. What they found would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. 5 of the addresses led to empty properties abandoned years ago. But in each one, they found sealed chambers, preserved families, monuments to twisted love created by people who disappeared before anyone had thought to look for them. The other 2 addresses were current residences, occupied by people who seemed normal, who had jobs and friends and lives that appeared ordinary. Search warrants were obtained. Basements were excavated. Nothing was found. No hidden chambers. No preserved victims, just ordinary homes, with ordinary people who claimed to know nothing about Robert Keller or his journal. But the families living in those houses, families of four, a husband and wife and two children in each case, all vanished within a week of the investigation. Disappeared as completely as the Petersons had, leaving behind cold meals and empty homes and questions that would never be answered. Hendricks sat in her kitchen a month later, the journal locked in her safe, and understood with horrible clarity that they'd only found the beginning, that Robert Keller had been part of something larger, a network of obsessed individuals who'd learned from each other, who'd perfected their terrible craft. How many more sealed chambers existed, hidden in basements across the country? How many more families sat preserved in darkness, monuments to love that had become something monstrous? She didn't know. No one knew. But sometimes, late at night, Hendricks would drive past the empty lot where the Peterson house had stood. She would sit in her car and stare at the darkness, and she would wonder what else lay buried beneath the surface of ordinary towns, behind the walls of ordinary houses, in the minds of ordinary people who smiled and waved and committed unspeakable acts when no one was watching. The Peterson case was solved. The mystery was answered. But Hendricks understood now that it had never really been about just one family or one killer. It had been about something darker, something that had been growing in the shadows all along. And somewhere, in a basement she couldn't locate, in a town she couldn't name, another family sat frozen in time, preserved in perfect love, waiting to be found, or waiting to never be found at all.